Hi, my name is Paul Ressel, composer, producer and instructor here at Point Blank. In this video we're going to be looking at some methods for creating evolving sounds using the new Maschine MK3 controller. For more details on our courses, visit pointblankmusicschool.com. Part of good sound design is understanding how to create sounds that are dynamic and evolve over time. The Maschine MK3 has some features that basically help you create sounds that can move, that shift and change over a certain number of bars or over a certain passage of the piece of music you're working on. The interesting thing about doing this is that you can have melodic content that's quite simple, but have sounds that basically evolve sonically over time and can then make your track much more interesting to listen to. So before we get started, let's create some melodies. On group 1, I have 2 samples set up. These are taken from live piano recordings. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sample a single note from this first sound. And you can see with the screens on the new MK3, it's much easier to get accurate sample cuts to make sure that you're getting exactly the sound that you want. It's just a lot more sort of real estate than there were on the MK2. Another thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to set the loop on this little piece I've taken out. So let's go ahead and open up keyboard mode. Another big change with the MK3 is that the different sort of pad modes have all now been given their own button. So it's much easier to go between pad mode, keyboard mode, chords and the step mode. So again, this just makes navigation and workflow much simpler. So if I start with the first sound, you can hear now how that's just looping one note. There are lots of ways using Maschine to create looping content. For example, you could slice a sound up, you could capture a loop from a sample, you could use things like note repeat to create sort of looping passages. But I like to create sort of looping sequences using a sort of more old school method of sampling, where you just basically create a repeat loop, like I have here in the sample editor, and just loop a single note. And the interesting thing about this is that the way sampling works, when you raise the pitch or lower the pitch, it basically changes the playback length of the sample itself. So, for example, a sample that's 1 octave above the original sound will basically be half the length, so playback at twice the speed. Now, the cool thing about this is that you can start creating some really interesting and intricate rhythmic and melodic content. What I'm going to do is go back to keyboard mode, and I'm going to set my scale to major pentatonic, just so I have access to a larger sort of area of the keyboard. And you can hear when I play octaves, you can hear how the octave higher basically plays at double the speed. If you take a harmonic relationship, for example, like a fifth, it also has a rhythmic relationship with the sound as well. So, for example, if I play C and it's fifth, which would be G, you can hear how there's quite an interesting rhythmic compatibility there, as well as a harmonic relationship. You can basically use this to create really kind of intricate sort of arpeggiating melodies without having to worry about sequencing or using note repeats or slicing samples or anything like that. The nicest new features on the MK3 as well is that the tap tempo is now a separate button. So if I had to work out what this tempo was, all I have to do is just hold down one of the notes and just tap along to it. And that'll give me a rough idea of what the tempo should be. So let's go ahead and record this melody and we can take it from there. Put the metronome on. So you can hear the loop wasn't exactly perfect. It might be dependent on sort of where I started and where I ended the notes. Another really interesting feature is how much easier it is now to edit events directly on the Maschine hardware. So all I need to do is just select all the events. If I look at the start position, they all seem to start in the right place. So that's good. And I can then just navigate over to the end, use the editing functions to make sure that those notes just go for as long as I need them to, just to the end of the loop there. Let's have a listen to that. So I can hear the tap tempo is a little bit out. Let's bring that down by 1 BPM. Okay, so that seems to be looping fairly well. I'm going to take the metronome off for the moment. And let's add another sound to it. So on the second pad, I have this piano chord. Again, I'm going to open keyboard mode. And I'm just going to trigger it over. So let's create a new pattern by duplicating the first one. And let's go ahead and record the chords over the part I just played. Great, and I'm just going to use the quantize 50% just to tighten it up a little bit. Have a look at the events, seem to be kind of in the right place. One of the most interesting recent features to Maschine has been the lock system. And this basically allows you to lock all the parameters of a current song and then basically go on a little sort of journey, changing parameters, adding things like feedback or delays or whatever it might be, and then being able to kind of hit the lock button again to bring it back to where it was. If I go to the effects on this group, I can show you what I mean. So if I hit lock, it's basically going to lock it in its current state. And then what I can do is I can start basically making changes. So I'm going to use the push controller to navigate through it. So let's add things like a little bit of resonance. A little bit of delay from the grain delay. Some reverb. You can see how you can kind of build these swells. And then when you're ready, go back to its original state. So this is not only a great performance tool, but it's a great production tool as well, because it allows you to put lots of movement into what you're doing and then be able to kind of get back to that first state as well. So before we go any further, let's bring some drums into this. I'm going to open the browser, use the push controller just to navigate. So let's go over to groups. Load in some user groups here. And I'm just going to load an orchestral percussion track. So let's see what this sounds like now. Another really cool feature is there's now a proper mixing section. So before you had to hit shift sampling to basically open up the mixer, but now with the screens you've got much more detail and you're able to basically mix the different parts of your track. You can use the push controller to move through it. So we can bring that kick up a little bit, down a bit. And it's much easier to mix and put all your different sounds together. So let's go back to the snapshot feature. If I hit shift lock, it's going to show you that I've already created one snapshot here. What we have access to is 4 banks of snapshots. So that gives you up to 64 different snapshots that you can take. So let's create another snapshot. Start a new one here. I'm going to go back to the group effects and let's basically set this at the maximum. So lots of reverb, lots of delays. And then I can lock that snapshot. And now if I want to, I can basically play between those two. So the dry version and the wet version. And you can see it doesn't skip a beat. All that's happening here is basically the parameter settings are changing. Another really interesting feature is you can also morph between different parameter settings. So if I set the morph mode on, put it to travel mode, and then basically select the number of bars I want it to move over, I can get it to move from the static snapshots all the way to the very wet snapshot that we had on the other side. And you can hear how all those parameters are very slowly changing. And if you go and have a look at them, you can actually see the different sort of movement happening on the different parameters. The snapshots will also remember things like mute and solo. So if we create a new one over here, so I could mute out the drums, make sure that we've got the right one selected. Let's lock that as is. And then if I went back to the other snapshot, I now have basically a breakdown, for example, where everything kind of drops out. And of course, I can do all the parameter movement I want at the same time as well. So, you know, we could bring in some of the different effects. Obviously, you've got to be careful because you don't want to lose where the actual pulse of the beat is. So, for example, what I can do now is basically have this section as a build-up, add some effects to it, really kind of make a moment out of it. You obviously want to be sure that you can still hear the impulse of the beat, so that when you drop back in, it's in the right place. And what you'll notice as well is if you've got two different snapshots, one that has certain things muted or soloed, if you travel between them, it basically just does a volume drop. I think it's a really smart way of dealing with it. So you can kind of hear, if I go over here, just hear how the drums very gently kind of fade out. So you could almost do an entire performance or an entire production just by working with different snapshots and different setups, literally performing them in real time. Another way of creating movement is with automation. Assign sort of different parameters to different knobs and then record the automation, moving those throughout the different patterns. And anyone who remembers how the MK2 used to work, setting up macros was something that you had to do on the software itself. So you had to create pages and you had to then assign the different sort of parameters to the different knobs. What's happened now is that you can basically set them all on the hardware. So if I'm going through my effects here, I can just hit Shift macro to go into assign mode, make sure that my macro is set to the group level. And all I have to do is use the capacitive knobs just to tap them. And by tapping them, it basically adds them to the macro page. So I can do this with all the different effects. So let's maybe take the size control of this one and the mix. With the beat effects, let's go for feedback and mix. And then finally, if we go over to the meta verb, just add a little bit of mix and size. And then if I go to my macro setting, I've got all the macros there in front of me, and it's a quick and easy way to basically shift and play with the sound over time. And it just gives you all those functions right there in front of you. Another way you can create movement is by using the new perform effects. So this is something that's materialized with the Maschine Jam. And now, because of the touch strip, it's part of Maschine MK3 as well. Perform effects only work at group level, so you need to make sure that you add them at the group level. And basically, the perform effects work with an engage system. So if I, for example, go to Reso Echo, the minute I let go of the touch strip, it basically disengages the effect. So again, this is something that's obviously designed more for performance, but it can be a really powerful tool for production as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.